Yum, yum!
Greg here from Pixel Fondue. MODO 14 has just released, and with its release, we now have a new mesh operation that allows us to create weight maps procedurally. So instead of just grabbing some vertices and assigning a weight map, or maybe painting some weights on existing vertices, we can create weight maps according to a set of rules. And these can change dynamically. They can change frame by frame. So they're actually really powerful. And this is really just the beginning of what can be done with these. And hopefully there's a lot more features in store for future versions of MODO with regards to procedural weight maps. This is just a quick tutorial on some of the possibilities here. And here you see some weight maps being created dynamically from a particle system that are being used to create a weight map, which is then being used as a fall off for a push operation. So this is an example of procedural weight maps being created on a frame by frame basis. With the sort of an input of a particle system, which is pretty cool. You can also use a particle system to do things like this, sort of like a wake with a ship. Now, this isn't great. I made it in like 5 minutes, but you can get the idea here. Let me just select the foam map here. You can kind of see what's going on here. The little white particles are the particle system, and those are sort of dynamically creating this weight map across this grid there. So that's what I'm going to show in this tutorial. And there's been a really great thread on the Foundry forum regarding the procedural weight maps. And it's mostly a lot of really cool stuff by Warren L. and Dino Zanko. I'm going to mispronounce Dino's name. Zianko? Zanko. It is Zanko. Dino and Warren create all kinds of cool stuff. They're both technical users. So I'm trying to simplify this a little bit. But if you just sort of browse through this thread, and I'll put this in the description, you can see just some really amazing uses for what's really just sort of a limited mesh operation that we have now. So if we get a little more feature rich on these weight map mesh operations, we can really do some pretty cool stuff, especially some motion graphic type stuff. All right, back here in an empty MODO scene, and the first scene I'm going to recreate is the one with the plane being bombarded by particles, and they're creating these sort of impact craters on the plane. And to do that, of course, you need a plane. So hit Shift and get a default plane in there. And then make sure you're in polygon mode, not item mode. And let's scale this up a little bit. And I'm going to press Shift D just to get some faceting here, just a number of times. We want as many. Well, you want a whole bunch of vertices, right? So you can see the weight maps a little bit better. The more vertices we have, the better we can view the weight maps we're going to be creating. So that looks pretty good. I'm just going to give this material. We'll just make it red, call it plane. And there it is over here in the shader tree. And to understand how this is going to work, we need to review texture replicators, because we're going to be using the texture replicator system within a fall-off system within the mesh operations system. So multiple systems in MODO working together is how we're going to get this effect. And if you haven't used texture replicators before, you can be forgiven. They're kind of obscure, although they're really powerful. They're really cool if you need to texture bomb your tank with a bunch of dents or something. Basically what it does is you can take any texture, an image, or just a color, and you can use a particle source, either vertices or a particle simulation, as a bunch of mini locators, a bunch of mini texture locators for that texture. So if I add a constant color here, so we go processing constant, and it's just like this greenish color, great, it covers up the whole layer, right? Just like you'd expect. In fact, I'll open up a render view over here so we can get a better view of this. But if I look under the texture locator, there's this particle source option, which you may not have noticed before for a texture replicator. And again, like any particle source in MODO, it's very flexible. It can take vertices from another object. It can take a particle simulation. It can take particle modifiers, which are these sort of procedural particle arrays. In this case, I'm just going to borrow some vertices from our plane here. So here's our plane is selected. I'm just going to be in vertex mode. I'm just going to grab some of these vertices. I'm going to Control-C copy them. In this empty mesh, I'm going to Control-V paste them. So now this empty mesh here has some vertices. We're going to use that as our particle system to demonstrate how this works. And so again, over here in our constant texture locator, under particle source, I'm going to select the mesh, which I should actually call particles. Whoops, there it is. And you can see what it did as I attempt to rename this particles. It just splatted this cyan color, this green color, every place there is a vertice, every place there's a particle. So that's kind of how that works. It's like a little mini texture locator. And there's a bunch of other channels here that opened up once we actually selected a particle system. So I can adjust the particle size, just make sure you're in item mode, press C for channel haul, so I can up the size or do whatever. I can also, there's a random size channel. It's just a number of useful channels in here, so I can get some random looking splats. I can also tighten up the edges with fall off bias and gain, kind of like that, or gain will give me like sort of sharp edges like that, or like the other way around this way, not so sharp edges. So there's a lot of stuff you can do with it, but in general, you kind of see what we're doing here. Now we have a texture based on particles, and we can use this as a texture fall off, right, within a mesh operation. So you can kind of get an idea of what we're doing here. So I'm going to close up the render window here, and I'm also going to delete our constant here just because it's annoying me. And I'm going to make this white just so our, not because it's annoying me, but because I want the weight maps to be more viewable in the viewport. And then, yeah, let's pop open a mesh operations window here, or mesh operations modeling stack. And with our plane selected, I'm going to add a set weight mesh operation. And this is the new mesh operation in MODO 14. So click that, got it there in the stack now, and I can give this map a name. We'll just call it happy. Why not? We're all happy these days in coronavirus land, aren't we? And hit return, and if I look over here in the Vertex Maps, I'll have a map called happy, and if I select it, we'll see it in the viewport here. Now make sure you're either in default mode with VMaps active here so you can see it, or you're in VMap mode. That's Control 2 to go to VMap mode. So you just want to make sure you view it. I like default mode. And this is a procedural vertex map now. So these values can change over time. They can change based on a set of rules you may create. And so they're really, really pretty flexible and really pretty powerful. And so as you can imagine, we're just going to go over here to the tool pipe and add a tool pipe operation. We're going to do a texture fall off. So over here under our fall offs, we'll do a texture fall off. And you might guess what we're going to do here. We're going to add a constant under the texture. So add texture in the texture fall off. We'll do a constant, C-O-N, constant. And a value is 100. If I make that 0, we've got, the fall off is affecting the set weight operation, and we're not getting textures anywhere. So that's fine. And we just want to do the same thing in our texture locator here for our constant. And in fact, I may actually pop open a schematic. It's a little bit easier to follow in a schematic, in my opinion. So let's just bring the plane in the schematic. And you'll see the plane's got this yellow diamond there, and there's our set weight. And in the tool pipe, we've got the texture fall off. And the texture fall off has a constant texture. And the constant texture is connected to the texture locator. And in that locator, we've got our particle source, right? Right there, particle source. I'm just going to use the same particle source we did earlier. So I can either select it here, particles, or I can drag my particles down here to the schematic, like so. Like so. Where is that? Is that not dragging? Add selected? Why isn't that coming down there? There it is. That was weird. And we could just plug that in here like that. And then you see what's going on. There's our little splats. And we've got 0 weight value there, while everything else is getting 100%. And of course, we want to invert this. And the best way to do this, in my opinion, is to, over here in our texture fall off, is just to grab our easing gradient and drag this leftmost one all the way up and this rightmost one all the way down. And then we can also sort of adjust our easing here like this. And in fact, if we go back to our texture locator, constant texture locator, we can adjust this particle size here. And I'm just going to drag to bump it up a little bit, and maybe a little random scale here like this. And then again, we can adjust our easing over here in the texture fall off. So you can see how this affects this, right? So whoops, we want it like that, and just some sort of easing here. Now we don't have additional tools to blur or grow these weight maps yet. You can actually use the Tracer X kit by Mario Baldi to do that. But I'd like to see these eventually integrated into MODO. So that's some stuff for the future. But right now, we've got kind of what we wanted, right? We have this dynamic weight map set with these particles. And if I actually grab the particles here, if I just sort of lasso them and transform them, I can move them around. You can see this weight map, changing just in real time here as I move it around. And so that's pretty cool. We're using these vertices as particles, but we don't want to use vertices as our particle source for the texture locator. We want to use a particle simulation. So let's unplug that. Don't need that. And then let's create a particle simulation. So I'm going to go over here to add item. I'm going to create a radial emitter, and there it is. And so the radial emitter will also create a particle simulation node. And again, I'm just going to drag these into the schematic. I think it's a little bit easier, again, to see how all this is going on here. So we've got our radial emitter that feeds into our particle simulation, which is going to feed into our particle source for our constant texture fall off. And I'm just going to grab my emitter and move it up a little bit. And if you're not familiar with particle simulation in MODO, I'll just recap that real quick. If you select the particle simulation node, I can actually change the color of the particles here. We'll do green and like something big like 6, just so we can see it. And then these 3 little green triangles down here in the lower right, if you've ever wondered what those were, the one on the left initiates the particle simulation. So it's just doing a live particle simulation, and we can adjust attributes here and just sort of watch it change real time. And then the next one over will actually play the timeline while simulating. And then the third one will actually calculate a particle simulation and cache it. So we'll do that last. So we just want to get this guy where we want it. And the first thing I want to do is turn on gravity. So we've got gravity going on here. So now we've got some gravity. And I'm just going to increase, I'm probably going to move this up just a little bit and maybe increase the radius of our radial emitter there. Looking pretty good. And yeah, I may even slow gravity down a little bit, just make things a little bit easier to follow. And yeah, I think that's pretty good. So we've got a bunch of little particles intersecting with our plane, and we want to use this particle simulation as as our as our particle source for our texture replicator there. So let me hit stop, and I'm going to hit the far right one to compute the simulation. So we'll compute it for, in fact, let me just make my scene a little bit bigger here, maybe like 300 frames. Sounds good. Why is MODO 14? MODO should default to 30 frames per second, just my opinion. 30 frames per second is what the world uses on YouTube now, and most animations are going digital. We're not making stuff for film, people. Anyway, big argument about this, by the way. Okay, so yeah, I just simulated it, so now they're flying through there in the simulation. I could just drag this back and forth because they're cached. And then I'm going to plug this into my particle source, and then I'm going to drag, and you're going to see these little splotches appearing, which is what we want. Splotch, splotch, splotch. And I'm probably going to make them a little bit bigger. So again, grab your replicator there and our particle size, press C and just sort of stretch them out a little bit. And so yeah, there it is. Weight maps generated dynamically, changing frame by frame from a particle simulation. Pretty sweet. Now we can use these weight maps however we want them. And in this case, I'm going to select my plane, and I'm going to add a push operation. I'll just do push. Whoops, if I can get my cursor there. Push, okay, looks good. And then you can see if I could push this up and down, it's pushing the entire plane. And so what I want to do is I want to use push, and I want to push it down a little bit. And I want to use a weight map fall off. So scroll down on push and go to the tool pipe and add a new tool pipe here. We don't want, delete our search characters there and do a, what do we want? Weight map fall off, and we're going to select hello or happy. There it is, happy. And so now we've got a weight map created down here in the stack initially, right? So we've got a weight map created here, and then we're using that weight map for the push simulation or the push operation there. And so there we go. Boom, 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 boom. And you can, we can take this wherever you want. I can like take my particle simulation here. What do I want to do? I think I want to take my plane here. If I go over here to my little joint tab, I can go to my dynamics controls, make the plane a static mesh, right? So now it's a dynamic object. So we've got some dynamic properties over here, bounce and friction. We could turn bounce off, and I want to select my particle system, particle simulation here. You might have to select the plane too. I'm not sure. Really what we're just doing here is we're going to link these two so the particles collide with the plane. So the plane has been made into a static rigid body. That's the first thing you had to do. And the next thing we do, we go over to the particle tab and click a dynamic collider. And now if I redo the particle simulation, we'll just click the far right arrow here to recompute the simulation. We should have particles colliding with the plane there. So yeah, there we go. So we can stop this whenever. And there we've got they're sort of building up on each other there like that. So yeah, pretty cool. We can actually do some procedural modeling now, right? So we just, if you like how this looks, I can select it. I can actually, I can do this. I can right click and say duplicate and freeze the mesh operation, or really you could just select the polygons, Control C, press N for a new mesh, and Control V. I'm just gonna isolate that there like that. And we've got to hide the locators, and there we've got a brand new mesh with a bunch of crater holes in it, and that's our, we just modeled the surface of the moon. So anyway, super useful. That's a pretty cool simulation there. Another thing we can do is the boat one. And you know what? I think I'll just load up the scene instead of do it step by step. So let me just open up that scene. Looks good. Okay, so here's our ship somewhere. Just get to our ship here. Whoop, turn off the isolation thing here and click back. And so here's our boat, and our boat is going to be going along the plane. We just got to make sure our ocean, my vertex map is selected, the foam map. And here I'm really just doing the same thing as I did before with a couple of differences. One, I've got, well, I'll just break it down here. I've got my, and the plane is procedural cube, right? It's a procedural plane instead of just the other one I just made a plane over here. But here it's a procedural cube. And then, so I can add more divisions if I want to, whenever I want, which is nice. So I can bump this up to 256 divisions if I want to, which is a nice, nice little way of using procedural mesh operations. Then I've got the set weight, and it's really the same thing. If I look at the schematic here, I've got set weight, and instead of just a texture fall off, I'm using a blend fall off. And the blend fall off is using two different fall offs, and I'll just sort of maneuver around here in the schematic to show how this works. The first one is just that constant one. In fact, I'll just plug this texture fall off in like this. It's just that constant fall off where we're using a particle system. And let me turn on locators here to show the particles. There's the particles around the ship. And so that's just like the one we just did. These particles are being simulated. And I'll show you, it's a little bit different kind of particle simulation. I'm not using a radial emitter, I'm using a curve emitter. But we've got a particle simulation with this fall off here. And then I'm also using a second texture fall off. This is just a animated cellular texture, sort of looks like ocean waves. And you can animate that on the Y, so it kind of looks like, you go with the texture locator here, and you can animate this however you want to. And I'm just gonna do a channel hall on the Y here, and you can see it's sort of this oceany looking effect. And so you can blend these two together over here on the blend fall off, and just multiply them together and put that into the tool pipe there. And so now we're blending, sort of multiplying the particle effect with this sort of animated texture effect, just to give it a little more natural look. And again, this isn't something you're going to get out of a water simulation, but it's just some like kind of cool example I kind of pulled out of my butt to show you guys. The particle system is really, there's just actually a curve on this. Let me just isolate it here. There's just this curve right here. It's just, I just selected some edges on the ship. And so if I select the ship here, you'll see that there's some edges. I can double click here, and I just selected these edges that are sort of at water level. And I created a curve out of them using the edge to curve command down here. And I created a new mesh, and that's how I got my curve mesh here, this curve mesh right here. And then I'm just using the curve mesh is actually going into a curve emitter. So curve mesh into the curve emitter, which is going into the particle simulation. In this case, I added a little bit of turbulence on it. Oh, and this one's actually kind of interesting. I'll actually show this. So I've got, if I just recompute the simulation, or actually just press this button down here to show the simulation happening, the curve is following the ship. It's parented to the ship, and it's emitting these particles. And there's a little bit of turbulence moving the particles around, but you see they're kind of flying off into space. We really want to constrain these just to the one position, really y equals 0, where this plane is, right? So we've got this plane here as well. We want the particles to be down on the plane instead of flying off into space, because they need to be intersecting the plane to really create this effect. And so what I did is I created this particle operator. And you can create a particle operator by just going over here to, we'll do a particle system here, and I can just create a particle operator just like that. So I create a particle operator, which let me drag down here into the schematic. There it is, it's hooked up to the simulation. And the operator itself, you can add any number of features, any sort of features relevant to a particle system, like position or particle ID or dissolve or collision time, all kinds of stuff. I'm just doing position, so just go over to position and hit OK. And then over here on channels, you'll see these position channels down here. And I drag them over, drag them into the schematic. And what I really want to do is just tell these particles that its position, I want this Y position to be 0. And so here I just have this little add node with, just select the node here, it's 0 plus 0 equals 0. So I'm just using this add node really to give me a value of 0 to plug into the Y. And that keeps the particles at 0. So when I simulate this over here or hit that key, all these particles are just staying, they're being emitted, but they're being constrained to 0. They're staying down to the 0 axis. Let me just actually hide my ocean to keep this, this is going really slow. Let me hide my ocean here. I'll go a little bit faster. So there we go. So all these particles are being emitted and they're being affected by turbulence, but they're being locked to a position, y position of 0. So I make sure they interact with my plane the way I want them to. So that's how I got that. Yeah, pretty cool. And again, yeah, I can just kind of drag through here. There's my particles, and there's my dynamic weight map there, which I can use, as a mask in a shader tree, or I can use for another mesh operation, like just like a push or some sort of turbulent motion there. Anyway, there's a lot you can do with it. It's a really, and we're just sort of scratching the surface about what we can do with these now, and really all we have is just sort of a set, this sort of set weight mesh operation, which honestly, once this gets a little more, involved in terms of, let me get my push here. Once we have a little more fleshed out system going where we can blur these, we can grow them, it'd be nice to set any sort of weight map. Right now we can only set weights or edge weights, and I believe we can set RGB maps as well. But there's all kinds of different mesh vertex maps. There's let me just select another mesh here. We can do RGB maps. We got pick maps. We've got all kinds of particle maps, particle size, particle dissolve. Those in particular are really of interest to me because you'd like to set particle size and dissolves procedurally to do some motion graphics types animation. So there's a lot we can do with this, and it's really just sort of kicking off. I know this is a long tutorial, but hopefully it got people excited. And you can also check out the thread over here at Foundry, which I will put in the description.
Yum, yum!